Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 33rd class of our combination fireside and course on the Baha'i teachings or the Baha'i view of the Abrahamic religions, the Baha'i faith being one of them. I wanted to begin by making sort of a sad allusion to what I heard on the news tonight. I know some of you or most of you are familiar with the fact that the fighting between the Gaza Strip and Israel is renewed. But one young reporter, I think on CNN, was saying, and one of the places where a 30-year-old Jewish man was attacked by angry Arabs was in a place called Akko. And it just struck me that to her, this was some obscure, unknown place. And of course, to us, it's the center of the world. It was just strange, that's all. Um, didn't hear of anything in Haifa itself, though, which is usually very, very calm and the when things get heated. Um, Tonight, I wanted to talk to you about Abdu'l-Baha as architect. I don't know if that's the right word. I know there was a study guide, 20, 30 years ago called Shoghi Effendi Architect. Uh, and I guess they're all architects and all construction foremen and so on. Of course, the architecture itself is the design of Baha'u'llah, but it is Abdu'l-Baha who carries out and instigates most of it and institutes a lot of it. I'm going to show you some PowerPoint. I hope it won't be too long and too tedious for you to look at print. But there's some passages I wanted you to see from the everything we're going to talk about tonight. It comes from one source, the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Well, the first thing I want you to understand is that Abdu'l-Baha, and I'm sure many of you know this, but maybe some of you don't, had many functions. It wasn't just the successor and head of the faith, center of the covenant, designated by Baha'u'llah in both the Kitab-i Aqdas and in the Will and Testament, of course. But he had many titles, many of which had to do with his various functions. And so I've highlighted them. This is from a passage that the Guardian wrote about the titles of Abdu'l-Baha. And he was called, of course, the Master. You can see that here. The Mystery of God. He was referred to as the sacred and glorious being, this branch of holiness. He was called the limb of the law of God, as his most great favor unto men, as his most perfect bounty conferred upon them, as one through whom every moldering bone is quickened. And then some more. This is the same passage, but another part of it. He was one whom God hath purposed, who hath branched from this ancient root. That's, of course, from the, I believe, from the Agdas. He is one round whom all names revolve, the most mighty branch of God, his ancient and immutable mystery. And then the passage continues in a very touching tablet that Baha'u'llah wrote to Abdu'l-Baha. He addressed him as the apple of mine eye. Glimpse, very touching glimpse of the relationship and love between them. A shield unto all who are in heaven on earth, a shelter for all mankind, a stronghold for whosoever hath believed in God. And then finally, at the end of this same passage, Shoghi Effendi alludes to the various things that he accomplished, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight, is how he did what he did and how he did it and why it is so strategically important. For while we attribute, and correctly so, the design of the administrative order to Baha'u'llah, it was Abdu'l-Baha who, through the guidance of Baha'u'llah, saw how this had to be effected, how it had to be put into some of the various parts of this organizational structure that were not yet in existence, that needed to be either put into existence or originated or defined. The successor of the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant, the successor of the manifestation himself, a position that was to empower him, and here's the list of things that empowered him to do: to impart an extraordinary impetus to the international expansion of his father's faith, to amplify its doctrine, to beat down every barrier that would obstruct its march, and to call into being, to delineate the features of its administrative order. The child of the covenant. Now, the child of the covenant is always, when I saw that, thought it was Abdu'l-Baha. The child of the covenant is the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, and the harbinger of that world order whose establishment must needs signalize the advent of the golden age of the Baha'i dispensation. Now, it's a very dramatic thing. This is a beautiful calligraphy by the famous calligrapher Mishkin Kalam, who was the one who designed the greatest name that we often put on our walls as a sign, as a prayer, Ya Baha'u'l-Baha. And so these are all the titles arranged in the calligraphic order by Mishkin Kalam. The works you might want to look at for further deep study on what we're going to discuss briefly are the Tablets of the Divine Plan, the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha is, of course, most crucial. Everything we're going to cite tonight is from that. Adib Tahir's Days, The Child of the Covenant, a study guide to the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha. It's about 300 pages long. The Declaration of Trust and Bylaws of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States and the Bylaws of the Local Assembly. Again, all of these ultimately spring from the actions of Abdu'l-Baha. My own book that I mentioned before, God's Plan for Planet Earth in Your Neighborhood, which goes through the various links in the covenant. Remember, that's where we are. We're discussing the covenant and this crucial link between Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. But now tonight we're focusing on the link between Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and not just Shoghi Effendi, but the House of Justice as well. Because without the creation, well, let me get to that in a second. Then Rui Study Circle Book 8 on the Covenant of Baha'u'llah, which studies these same links in great detail. Shoghi Effendi's The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, which according to Leroy Ois was effectively Shoghi Effendi's Will and Testament. Text for the Study of the Covenant, which is a collection that the Baha'i Publishing Trust has put out that contains such works as the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, or I'm not sure, I don't have it in front of me, but it has the Kitab-i-Ad and I believe in the Will and Testament. The Universal House of Justice, the Constitution of the House of Justice, and then finally the Institution of the Counselors. So these are all the documents that emanate from the work that Abdu'l-Baha was to do indirectly, and sort of the final establishment of all the institutions, not that ever will be, but all the essential institutions that form the framework of the Baha'i Administrative Order. So let's look at the four I mentioned last week. There are four major institutions that Abdu'l-Baha either created or delineated or put into effect, instigated. The first one, of course, is the guardian. Now, I'm going to quote to you here from The Priceless Pearl by Riyad Hanum, and then also from a talk by Leroy Ios, Hand of the Cause, from a talk he gave in Johannesburg, South Africa, just a few months after the Guardian had passed. And it's a very touching talk. You can Google it. It's called In the Days of the Guardian. And it's a wonderful talk. You can get the audio of it and you can read it. It's the most, it makes you feel more intimacy and love for the Guardian than anything I've experienced other than reading The Priceless Pearl itself, which is a very substantial work by Riyad Hanum. So they both say essentially the same thing, and that is that Shoghi Effendi had no idea that there was going to be such a thing as a guardianship, even though there is a hint that such a position might exist, as mentioned in or alluded to in the Kitab-i-Aqdas. He had no foreknowledge of the existence of the institution of guardianship, least of all that he was appointed as guardian. That the most he had expected was that perhaps because he was the eldest grandson, Abdu'l-Baha might have left instructions as to how the Universal House of Justice was to be elected, and he might have been designated the one to see these were carried out and act as the convener of the gathering that would elect it. Now you've got to remember, much of what you read when you study how the LSA functions are quotes from Abdu'l-Baha. He was describing how to consult and how to construct a well-functioning local assembly. So the local assemblies existed, and how to consult existed, and all the attitudes we should carry with us when we go into the chambers of that institution already existed. But there was no distinction between a local assembly and a national assembly. There were no national assemblies. Now, this is a crucial point. Same thing stated by Ios. When he returned to the Holy Land, meaning from England, after he heard that Abdu'l-Baha had passed, he had in mind from things which Abdu'l-Baha had said to him, and I am now telling you what he said, that I had in mind that Abdu'l-Baha would give me the honor of calling the great conclave, calling together the great conclave which would elect the Universal House of Justice. And I had thought in his will and testament that probably was what he was instructing to be done. This is what everybody expected. And you've got to remember, Shoghi Effendi is 24 at this point. And not only a young man, but one of several grandsons of Abdu'l-Baha. And suddenly the faith is headed by this young man, much to the surprise and, may I say, dismay of the family, who must turn their obeisance from this immaculate elder of Abdu'l-Baha to this young man whom some of them probably did not know his capacity, and the faith was to be headed by him. So they wanted the election of the House of Justice. That's what they expected to happen. Well, Abdu'l-Baha, with his architectural prowess, made it so that that could not occur. Why? Well, first let's deal with the several features of the institution of the guardianship: the authority, the position, the succession, how appointed, and the authority of the hands of the cause, and so on. So we're going to go through these: authority, the position, and succession for each of the four institutions he created. So the first thing he did was create the guardianship itself. Well, that in itself did not necessarily prevent the election of the House of Justice. He could have said, all right, let's select the House of Justice. So what prevented it? Well, first, the part of the will that is so crucial that would have shocked everyone hearing it when it was read on the 2nd of January in 1922, Abdu'l-Baha died in 21, and then the will was read for the first time on the 2nd of January. O my loving friends, after the passing away of this wronged one, it is incumbent upon the Agsan, the Afnan of the sacred lote tree, the hands of the cause of God, and the loved ones of the Abha beauty to turn into Shoghi Effendi, the youthful branch branched from the two hallowed and sacred lote trees. This would be the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and the fruit grown from the union of the two offshoots of the tree of holiness. As he is the sign of God, the chosen branch, the guardian of the cause of God, he unto whom all the Agsan, the Afnan, the hands of the cause of God and his loved ones must turn. So that's the first shock to those hearing this, including Shoghi Effendi. And as you know, as we'll discuss at another time, he was so overwhelmed by this that several times he simply had to leave Haifa and go to Switzerland to gird himself up, or as he says in this talk to Leroy Ois, is quoted by Leroy Ois, that he had to go and face himself and fight with himself until, in effect, all his self was gone and he was an empty vessel. He said, then I could become guardian of the cause. So what was his authority? He, first of all, is the infallible interpreter of the text. He is the expounder of the words of God, and after him will succeed the firstborn of his lineal descendants. He is president of the Universal House of Justice. The guardian of the cause is the sacred head and the distinguished member for life of that body. The position during his life then, of course, he was director or head of the cause itself. So he was the executor of the cause. He was also the infallible source of understanding this text, but also teaching. So in other words, the twin institutions of the faith are the executive, the House of Justice, and the learned, so the rulers and the learned. The learned are those who are responsible for teaching the cause, first under the hands of the cause, and then the counselors who succeeded them. That institutional outline that I've showed you before, and I'll show you tonight. The succession. Again, so far, no problem with having the House of Justice elected. The succession becomes, of course, a very important issue when we get to one of the next links in the covenant of Baha'u'llah, and that is the link between the guardian and the House of Justice, or really between the guardian and what's called the interregnum, the custodians of the cause, the group of 9 members of the hands of the cause, whom they elected among themselves. It would be the firstborn of his lineal descendants. O beloved of the Lord, it is incumbent upon the guardian of the cause to appoint in his own lifetime him that shall become his successor, that differences may not arise after his passing. He that is appointed must manifest in himself detachment from all worldly things, must be the essence of purity, must show in himself the fear of God, knowledge, wisdom, and learning. But another part of the will and testament says, if this is not possible, that is, if the firstborn does not manifest these qualities, thus should the firstborn of the guardian of the cause not manifest in himself the truth of the words, the child is the secret essence of its sire. That is, should he not inherit the spiritual within him, the guardian of the cause of God, and his glorious lineage not be matched with a goodly character, then must he, the guardian of the cause, choose another branch to succeed him. Third, after the guardian has made a decision, the decision must be approved. And this is something maybe some of you aren't aware of. Must be approved by vote of the 9-membered body of the hands of the cause. And this is how that 9-membered body comes about. So this is something else. Hands of the cause existed. That is, there were those who were called hands of God. But the Abdu'l-Baha created, he was the architect of the institution of the hands of the cause. And here's where he creates it. The election of these 9 must be carried either unanimously or majority vote from the company of the hands of the cause of God. And these 9, whether unanimously or by a majority vote, must give their assent to the choice of the one whom the guardian of the cause hath chosen as successor. This assent must be given as such wise as the assenting and dissenting voices may not be distinguished. And here's where you have the clue to the electoral process: secret ballot, no electioneering, no voices of assent or dissent. So we have, how were they appointed? What is their authority? What is their function, and what are their, how are they succeeded? What is their succession after them? These become very important matters later on. Oh, friends, the hands of the cause must be nominated and appointed by the guardian of the cause of God. All must be under his shadow and obey his command. Should any within or without the company of the hands of the cause disobey and seek division, the wrath of God and his vengeance will be upon him, for he will have caused a breach in the true faith of God. And of course, this happened, and we'll discuss that later when we get to the custodians. Authority. This body of the hands of cause is under the direction of the guardian of the cause of God. He must continually urge them to strive and endeavor to the utmost of their ability. And here's their 2 central functions: to diffuse the sweet savors of God, to teach, and to guide all the peoples of the world. And this has to do with protection, for it is the light of divine guidance that causeth all the universe to be illumined. So these are their 2 functions: be in charge of promulgating teaching and to see the protection of the cause. Function, which is not that much distinct from authority, but a little bit. My object is to show that the hands of the cause must be, and this is the protection, must be ever watchful, and so soon as they find anyone beginning to oppose and protest against the guardian of the cause, cast him out from the congregation of the people of Baha, and in no wise accept any excuse from him or her. Of course, that's understood. The hands of the cause of God must elect, and here's the establishment, here's the architectural hand of Abdu'l-Baha. The hands of the cause of God must elect from their own number 9 persons that shall at all times be occupied in the important services in the work of the guardian of the cause. The election of these 9 must be carried either unanimously or majority vote from the hands of the cause, and these, whether unanimously or majority vote, must give their assent to the choice of the one whom the guardian of the cause hath chosen as his successor. So we've already seen that, but it's good to see it in the context of their function. Finally, the succession. Only the guardian can appoint hands of the cause, and so when Shoghi Effendi deceased in 1957, no more hands of the cause could be created or appointed. And this is why, to take over their duties, the Continental Boards of Counselors was created. And there's a whole history on how that came about. First, there were auxiliary board members before there were counselors. They were assistants to the hands. Then after the hands diminished in number, you had the counselors, and the auxiliary board members were auxiliary to the counselors, and as they are today. The Universal House of Justice. Now, here is where we find out why the House of Justice could not have been elected during the when Abdu'l-Baha died, or at least immediately after Abdu'l-Baha died. The Universal House of Justice is to be universally elected and established. In other words, there must be universal suffrage. All of the people of the Baha'i faith are part of the electorate. And there's a 3-tiered process, as you'll see in item 4 here, and we'll get to that in a second. Its members must be manifestations of the fear of God and daysprings of knowledge and understanding, must be steadfast in God's faith and the well-wishers of all mankind. By this house is meant the universal house of justice. That is, in all countries, a secondary house of justice must be instituted, not the universal house. And these secondary houses of justice must elect the members of the universal one. Now, here's the problem. There were no secondary houses of justice. There were only local assemblies. So yes, you had assemblies and you had guidance about how they were to be run, but you did not have what we now call, or temporarily now call, national spiritual assemblies, which are, of course, not always national. They're sometimes territorial. They may be island nations and so on. And so immediately, the guardian saw, as he realized, as he read this, there can be no election of the House of Justice until you have secondary houses of justice. And this, as many of you know, was one of the first things and foremost things that the guardian undertook. It was most fiercely promoted during the last plan of the guardians from 1953 to 63, the 10-year World Crusade, where every effort was made to establish national spiritual assemblies in as many countries as possible, so that you would have upholding the House of Justice, this superstructure, as many pillars as possible. As you can imagine, just architecturally, it's a nice analogy, because the more pillars you have, the more mighty is the structure upheld. So this means you have in the election of the House of Justice, as described by Abdu'l-Baha, another creation of his, a three-tiered process. So instead of electing the House directly from the group of the body politic of the Baha'i community as a whole, the community elects delegates that are sent to elect the secondary House of Justice, and the national spiritual assemblies or secondary houses of justice elect the House of Justice. So first election, elect the delegates. Second election, elect the NSA. Third election, elect the House of Justice. So that means, while not directly, every Baha'i participates in electing the House of Justice. So you have, in effect, three levels of refinement, if you will, by which we presume the most choice and capable people are selected. What is the structure? Well, first of all, the men of the House of Justice is how Baha'u'llah describes the membership, and the guardian confirmed that this was meant to be confined to males for a reason that we do not know yet, though Abdu'l-Baha assures us that it has nothing to do with the capacity of women, so we must logically deduce it as something circumstantial, because he says, when you know, it will be as clear as the sun at midday. In other words, it's something very obvious, but you're not ready to appreciate it or understand it at this point, but you will. They are elected to a 5-year term. What is their authority? Unto the most holy book everyone must turn, and all that is not expressly recorded therein must be referred to the universal House of Justice. That which this body, whether unanimously or by a majority vote, doth carry, that is verily the truth and the purpose of God himself. Whoso doth deviate therefrom is verily of them that love discord, hath shown forth malice and turned away from the Lord of the covenant. Infallibility. This has become a big issue, even in the last decades. Not a big issue insofar as the House of Justice was concerned, but among some Baha'is who believe that the infallibility simply meant the buck stops here, that this is the final decision. But that's not what the writings say. Look at what is stated in the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha. First, decision-making. It is incumbent upon these members of the House of Justice to gather in a certain place and deliberate upon all problems which have caused difference, questions that are obscure, and matters that are not expressly recorded in the book. presumably the Agdas and the other books in which Baha'u'llah has either stated or restated the laws of the faith. Whatsoever they decide has the same effect as the text itself. So in other words, when you see a law by or guidance by Baha'u'llah and the guidance and laws established by the House of Justice, you can't say one is higher or more important than the other. It has the same effect, meaning the same weight. But here comes the most important thing in one sense. They are infallible. Now, how can a group of fallible individuals create infallible decisions? Well, read what Abdu'l-Baha says here. And now, concerning the house of justice, which God hath ordained as the source of all good, and freed from all error, it must be elected by universal suffrage, that is, by the believers. And we've already seen that process. Because it has the same authority as the text. This is my own writing now. This is not from the Will and Testament. Because it has their decisions, the same authority as the text, believers can't pick and choose any more than they can with the laws and guidance of Baha'u'llah. In other words, you can't say, well, I like this decision of the House of Justice to say the institute courses or whatever, but I don't like another one they did, so I'll do this one, but not that one. No, all of their decisions has this authority. And so what do we infer from freed from all error? There is, for example, not a passage, but a statement by an individual I recall who said, garbage in, garbage out, meaning if the House of Justice doesn't have proper information when they're making a decision, then their decision can hardly be infallible. Not so. In the same way that Abdu'l-Baha himself was divinely guided by Baha'u'llah, as was the guardian, so the House of Justice, when elected according to this guidance, and when meeting according to the parameters set forth by Abdu'l-Baha, they are divinely guided themselves, whether they are even aware of it or not. So there is, if you will, a certain spiritual process, or you can say mystical if you want, though that has a bad connotation in some quarters. But you can say that they are divine, they're divinely inspired because Baha'u'llah is overseeing what goes on. Secondary houses of justice. Well, we're not going to a lot into this, but how are they elected? Indirectly by representatives. In the United States, there are 171 of them as designated by the guardian. 19 times 9 is how that number was derived, and they are apportioned. And that is, you have these delegates apportioned to the amount of Baha'i population in a given area. So if you have a lot of Baha'is in South Carolina, then South Carolina is going to have more delegates. So it's approximately, I don't know what it is now, but 500 to 1,000 Baha'is equals one delegate, something like that. It changes, of course, as the numbers change. Their authority derives from the bylaws and the articles of incorporation as devised originally in consultation with the guardian by the United States NSA. And that became the paradigm, if you will, for the bylaws and articles of incorporation for all the NSAs, and the same thing with the LSAs. So how do they function? They carry out the administration of the faith and implement the teaching plan goals assigned to it by the Universal House of Justice. So we end up with this. Administrative order. This is something I've showed you before. It's a chart I put together, but it shows you the basic institutions of the Baha'i faith. As you can see here, there's no lines connecting them yet. That happens here, where we see how the local level, you have the cluster. Within the cluster, You have the local spiritual assemblies. You also have non-Baha'is who are participating, of course, in the creating of neighborhoods. Individual, sometimes what used to be called isolated believers, they're no longer isolated because they're part of clusters, no matter where they are. Registered groups. And then the core group, which governs not the administration of the community, that's done by the local assemblies, the governmental body that's incorporated. Oops. But by guiding the teaching. So you have the membership of the core group that is assisted and guided by the auxiliary board members and their assistants. Sorry, I did it again. In the community. The RTI board, the Regional Training Institute, which is overseen by, elected by the local assemblies. But, sorry folks, excuse me, the regional councils are elected by the local assemblies, and the function of the Regional Baha'i Council, which is not a governing body, is to oversee the Regional Teaching Institute in concert with, in conjunction with the House, with the National Assembly. And so you have these two branches of twin institutions. Originally, of course, both of these were embodied in Baha'u'llah and in Abdu'l-Baha and in Shoghi Effendi. But Shoghi Effendi was, the guardianship was to have two functions: to be head of the teaching, devise the teaching plans, as Abdu'l-Baha did. And so Abdu'l-Baha was created the teachings plans with the tablets of the divine plan, and he created the institutions. And so he was center of the covenant, and he created the tablets of the divine plan. Same with the guardian. During his lifetime, he had to serve both functions: create the teaching plans, the first two 7-year plans he created, and guide the community, create the national assemblies. And so there's a lot of writing dealing with how each was, how this was intended to be, and how it now functions without any problems, even though the guardian had to serve both functions during his life. And now the House of Justice works not in both capacities. The guardianship still exists. So when they consult on a matter, the first thing they can do is consult the writings, and particularly that includes the writings of the guardian. So the guardianship, and he wrote about virtually every conceivable problem that could occur. They consult his writing. And I finish up with this, which is, I think, kind of interesting as an overview of what's going to happen. I've showed you some of these before that I put together. This is one that was put together by Paul Lample and Leilani Smith. This is before Paul was elected to the House of Justice. Excuse me, Mr. Lample. You have the Baha'i cycle, which lasts 500,000 years. The Baha'i era, which is the dispensations of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And you can see, so the first epoch, if you will, of the heroic age is the ministry of the Bab. The second epoch is the ministry of Baha'u'llah, and the third epoch is the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha. And then we have the formative age, and we're in the fifth epoch of the formative age. And so here are the teaching plans we've had, and all those. You can see them here: 7-year plan, 7-year plan, those were by the guardian. The 10-year World Crusade here, that was devised by the guardian. The 9-year plan, 5-year plan, 7-year plan, 6-year plan, the 1-year plan, and then the series of 5-year plans. I've got that mixed up somehow. So this will all be on a PDF file for you on my site, on the YouTube channel. And this is the Qibla with which we close our class.